And good morning. Welcome to Courageous Path Freedom session number 9. This is our adult and youth session of the virtual vacation Bible school, and it's doubling as Sunday school for us right now, particularly during this COVID type of environment. Today we're in Exodus chapter 3. Moses has been born. His mother came up with a plan to put him in position to where possibly his life could be saved. She certainly couldn't control the outcome of the events, but she was doing her best to spare her baby boy's life from Pharaoh's edict that all the babies should be killed. Pharaoh had ordered all the baby boys to be, if they were born alive, to be pitched into the Nile River. Well, she obeyed Pharaoh's order. But before she pitched him into the river, she took a basket. She waterproofed that basket by lining it with tar and pitch. She placed the boy in the basket upstream, just a little ways from where Pharaoh's daughter and her maids were known to go to take their baths and enjoy the water. And the current takes baby Moses straight to Pharaoh's daughter. She finds him, she adopts him, has pity on him. So mama's done all she can do. Pharaoh's daughter is actually going to pay Moses' own mother, Yoshebel, to nurse him. Pharaoh's daughter obviously could not nurse the child herself. She had not had a baby. Therefore, she did not have the milk to provide the child. The sister of Moses, 12-year-old Miriam, Mama had asked her to stay there in the bulrushes, in the middle of the swamp there at the Nile River, to see what would happen to the baby. Mama doesn't want to wonder. She needs to know. She needs to have closure one way or the other. When Pharaoh's daughter finds this basket, opens it up, sees the Hebrew child in there, she's not dumb. She knows that baby was placed in that basket to try to save it from her father's death sentence. But her compassion for the baby is more than her fear of what her father can do to her. So she's agreed already to adopt the child as her own. And at that moment, out of the swamp pops 12-year-old Miriam. Would you like me to go and find a nurse for her? The baby? Nobody asked the question that should be obvious in everyone's mind. Who is this kid and what is she doing in the middle of the swamp? Because she's out there with the snakes, with the crocodiles, with the flies and the mosquitoes and whatever other vermin might be out there, to try to see what happens to her brother. She has to put herself at risk of great harm. She doesn't. Pharaoh's daughter doesn't ask the question, who are you and where did you come from? She knows sort of in the back of her head, but it's one of those, I know the answer, so I'm just not going to bother to ask this question because I don't want to be caught knowing too much. Yes, go and find the nurse. And these two women make the deal. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace. Moses becomes a commanding general in one of Pharaoh's armies. Moses one day sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he intervenes and he accidentally kills the man and has to flee because he's afraid of what Pharaoh will do to him. He winds up in the land of Midian, which to you and I would be the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. I'm going to reach back here and get the big map and hold it up for a minute. Moses has been in Egypt, somewhere around this area. Now he has to go all the way to Midian, which is what you and I would know as Saudi Arabia. When he gets there, he discovers that some shepherds, some male shepherds, are bullying some female shepherdesses who have gotten there first and drawn the water out of their father's well. But these guys waited until the girls had done all the work. And then they come, because they're guys, they're bigger and stronger. They're trying to push the girls and the girls' flocks away to water their own animals. Moses has rested by that well. He intervenes, orders them back, makes sure that the guys know that, nope, they were here first. They're going to get the water. And the girls tell their father about it. And before long, Moses has been married to one of Jethro, also known as Ruel. in the book of Exodus. He's married to one of Jethro's daughters, and he's spending the next 40 years of his life in the desert working for his father-in-law. That's a severe career change from being one of the princes of Egypt, serving in Pharaoh's army, having access to all the wealth of Egypt and all the luxury, to go from there to a guy on the run for his life, fleeing across the desert with literally the clothes on his back, and winding up serving as a shepherd. God's preparing him for the mission that God has for him in what seems like the good times and what seems like the bad times, because it's all part of God's timing. So we pick up today with Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. It's not even Moses' property, it's Jethro's property. Moses has a pretty good idea that once Jethro passes away, Moses himself will inherit this property, because Jethro has no sons to inherit, and Moses is married to Jethro's daughter. So he has a pretty good idea that he'll one day inherit at least some of this property, but it's not his yet. And as it turns out, it's never going to be his, because God has a different plan in mind for Moses. Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, that's also known as Sinai, and it may say that in your Bible, the mountain of God. Now notice it's already known as the mountain of God even before Moses gets there. That's one little detail that Cecil B. DeMille got right. My Old Testament professor used to refer to the Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, Yvonne DiCarlo, all these famous Hollywood actors, as that horrible little movie. Because, of course, the Hollywood had to Hollywoodize it and try to make this love triangle between Ramses and Nefertiti and Moses that just never existed. But Mr. DeMille got that part right, which is that the locals thought that God dwelt on that mountain long before Moses showed up. He's just out there doing his thing, pasturing his father-in-law's sheep. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And that's why we got out this prop that we use a lot at Christmas time. This looks like a burning bush. Moses sees this while he's pasturing the flock, and it catches his attention because it's an unusual thing. It's not unusual to see something catch fire. Wilderness fires, brush fires, forest fires happen all the time. What was unusual was the bush is on fire, but it is not being burned. This morning on my way to church, I noticed we have 3 pecan trees in our front yard. One of them, sometime last night, a rather large limb just fell off and hit the ground. Now I know why the dog was barking in the middle of the night so incessantly. He heard what none of the 3 human beings living in the house heard. He heard that limb fall. So now we got to do something with this pecan limb. And we happen to have a neighbor who has a chainsaw. So we're going to get that wood cut up, because the pecan wood will make a very good fireplace addition this fall. Moses sees a bush. Leaves and wood should be being consumed, but it isn't. And so he goes up to where the bush is at up on the mountain, and he there has an encounter with God, where God is going to reveal himself to him, where God is going to tell him, Moses, I have a task for you to do. He is being called to this task, and Moses is going to have objection after objection after objection. And finally, God will get mad at him and just say, just go do it. God's relating to Moses at that moment, kind of like a parent with a child. Do it because I said so type of moment. Several years ago, when I was still working out of the chapel, we used to do, in conjunction with several of the Catholic churches in the surrounding Wiregrass area, a day retreat for teenagers. Normally, we would host that out at Fort Rucker because we had the biggest facility. We had this day retreat, and all the Catholic youth ministers in the area and I would get together and plan this particular retreat. This one was going to be on the topic of learning to follow whatever God's call is for your life, whether God's calling somebody into a form of ministry or whether he's calling them into just being a good neighbor, somebody who cares about other people, somebody who does community service, volunteers in their spare time, but learning how to be God's people in the world. And because it was a group of youth ministers, sometimes youth ministers have some far out there type of ideas, and we came up with a flyer for this retreat. How big is your butt? B-U-T, as in your objections for why you don't want to do something. And the more we thought about it, the funnier it got, and the more like, let's do it. And of course, as soon as we thought about it, somebody pointed out, we start putting out posters and flyers like that, and we're going to get calls and complaints from parents and from our pastors, and in my case, from our chaplains. But, we decided, what, that's a good thing because it'll draw attention to the retreat. So up our posters and flyers went all over the region. How big is your butt? Come find out at Wiregrass Catholic Youth Day. And it got exactly the reaction we hoped it would get. Teenagers were all eager to come and find out. We even came up with some icebreaker activities that I won't describe here, but it went along with the theme. I'll leave it at that. Because you can get away with doing things with young people because they're a little more flexible and they like to have fun. Nowhere in all of Scripture does it say thou shalt bore them into the kingdom. So we decided to teach them the Bible in a way that would be fun. And come find out how big is your butt, your objections to serving God. And that was the whole theme of our day retreat. Moses is about to find out how big his butt is. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight. Why the bush is not burned up. It's an unusual thing. He's questioning it. It's a good thing sometimes to question, as long as you're questioning to get an honest answer. Over the years, I've dealt with and continue to have to deal with a few people who, because they know that I know a bit about the Bible, they'll just want to come and ask questions, but they aren't really seeking honest answers towards figuring out if this is really true and they can trust it, and maybe they should consider giving their hearts to Jesus. Some people just want to have an argument for the sake of having an argument. And once you are certain, you don't want to push somebody aside. Once you're certain that that's what they're doing, you kind of have to call them out on it. So with a few people, I've had to say, look, I will be willing to try to answer or find an answer for you for any honest question you've got. But if you're just here trying to waste my time just to argue incessantly, really, go do it yourself. I'll point you in the right direction for some resources. But if you're honestly not interested in knowing the truth, don't waste any more time, because I could be talking to people who really are interested in hearing the gospel. And sometimes they'll get offended when I've just called them out on, oh, that's really what they're doing. At least a couple of times people have laughed and said, yeah, I just like to argue. I like to make up my own mind. I say, well, you can do that, but because you have a free will. But the day will come when you're going to discover this one important truth. There is a God, and you are not him. What you going to do then? That's just really what they need to hear sometimes. Moses is at least curious enough. He sees this bush is burning, but it's not burning up, which is what it ought to do. Suddenly, it's more important to find out what's going on there and why than it is to see to it that the sheep don't step in some hole and break their leg, or a wild beast doesn't come up and drag one off. He goes up to where the bush is at. When the Lord, notice that's all capital letters. God's sacred name. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Notice God called him by name. God knows who you are. God knows you better than you know you. God calls him by name. Then he said, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He also said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Moses is bowing down on the ground. He's taking those shoes off. He's realized that whatever's going on here, he's confronting somebody that's bigger and greater and mightier than he is, and he is willing to be humble in the presence of this person. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. Notice my is capitalized. God's calling these people his own people. I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land overflowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel is come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses is about here we just finished reading in verse 10. Verse 11, Moses is going to have his first but moment. But, and he'll have an objection to why he does not want to do this. But before Moses opens his mouth in this next passage, let's stop and look real briefly at some of the big facts that are here. God's heard. Some people, the ones who like to just ask questions and object, but they don't really want to believe. Well, where's God been for the last 400 years? Didn't he hear him at year 100, year 200, year 300? Why did he wait 400 years? Did God just wake up? Because you'll run into those kind of people who want to ask questions because they're not interested in the truth. They just want to attack your faith. Well, if we went back into Genesis chapter 15, when God had Abraham cut up the pieces of some animals, and God appeared as a smoking, flaming torch passing between them, and God made the covenant with Abraham. God told Abraham at that point that the day would come when Abraham's descendants would become enslaved in a foreign country. He didn't tell Abraham which country, and he didn't tell when in the future it was going to happen. He just said, your descendants will be sojourners and strangers in a foreign land, and they'll be enslaved. And he told them how long it would be, 400 years. But that at the end of the 400 years, I, God, will bring them out with great wealth and great possessions with my own strong right arm, and I will bring them back to this land. God gave Abraham some details because God is in control of history. God is running this show. History is really his story. From the beginning, God laid out a plan to redeem mankind to himself. You can find that in Isaiah 46, verses 8 through 10, if you want to look that up sometime. I am God, there is no other. There is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning. God had told Abraham what was going to happen to Abraham's future generations. Abraham's not going to live to see it. Isaac hears it from his father. He remembers it. He passes it on to his sons. Isaac doesn't live to see it. Esau and Jacob would have heard it from their father Isaac. They didn't live to see it either. Jacob lives to go down into Egypt. Jacob doesn't know for sure if that's the place that he's going to have his descendants enslaved. He knows his son Joseph was enslaved there, but Joseph was enslaved there by his own brothers. Jacob enjoys Pharaoh's favor. In fact, the Egyptians send a large party to come to Jacob's funeral when his sons carry his body back to Canaan, to put him in the cave at Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Leah were buried. Some of the Egyptian officials went with them because they honored Jacob so much. It was only after Joseph dies and the Pharaoh who knew Joseph died that there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So the answer to that question is it was now God's timing. Sometimes we go through some things in life that we don't understand why we're going through them. Why somebody we know and love may be suffering from a debilitating disease. Why we may be suffering a job loss, the loss of a family member, some kind of tragedy in life. A lot of people are starting to wonder what's going on with 2020 because so many horrible things have happened. In fact, there are a few going on right now. There's a hurricane that is already ashore in Texas. By now, it may be in Mexico. I didn't see the weather this morning. There's another one bearing down on the Hawaiian Islands. I've got friends in Hawaii. We were military connected for 23 years. I've got friends who are stationed on Hawaii, and I sent some of them Facebook messages last night letting them know, hey, I'm praying for you, and I'm going to remind all the prayer warrior teams to pray for y'all as you're facing this approaching storm. It helps when you're going through some kind of hard time, regardless of what it may be, to know that there are people out there praying for you, lifting you to the throne. God hadn't forgotten his people. It was necessary that they go through this experience so that they could go from being a family to a nation that serves God. The time was right. The leader was there in place. The leader doesn't know he's a leader. Moses probably knows from his own childhood the story of how his mother and his sister and Pharaoh's daughter all conspired together there to see to it that once he was discovered in the river, he was allowed to live. Pharaoh's daughter, when she found that basket, she could have said, oh, my father said throw all these babies in the river, and she could have done it herself or had one of her maids do it. If any woman would be willing to do that, to take a precious little child and throw them to a certain death. She might have had to got one of his male soldiers to do that. But she didn't. She had compassion on them, and she risked the ire of her father in raising this boy as her own son. He enjoyed the palace for the first 40 years of his life. He had the finest education, the best clothes, the best food, the best schooling. He served as a leader, commanding one of Pharaoh's armies. He's a logical choice to be the one that God wants to use to go and deliver his people. He is one of those Hebrew people. He knows he's a Hebrew. But he also knows the ways of the Egyptians. He knows how to be a commander. And because he spent 40 years of his own life kind of in exile in the desert, he also knows the ways of the desert. Moses, unless you're brain dead, the minute God says, I want you to go to Egypt and bring those people out, you ought to know one thing for sure. Of course, everything in my life points to this moment. God's been silently preparing me in ways that I don't even know about for the task that he's got for me. That's what he ought to be thinking. That's not what he's thinking. Just like when God calls you, whether he's made the initial call to salvation, and I'm assuming most of the people who are watching this have already had that call to salvation, but there's a chance that somebody is watching this who hasn't. God called you first to salvation, and then God is going to gift you and equip you after you have agreed to become part of his family to do something to share God's message with other people. Your gift might be what you would think of as a simple gift. Somebody's got to see to it, for example, that the babies are cared for in the nursery. Somebody's got to change the diapers. Somebody's got to see to it that buildings are cleaned. And in this COVID environment, all of a sudden, the ministry of the people who clean the schools and the churches and the restaurants and the banks and the other businesses, all of a sudden, it's not so important that you might be the bank's head teller, lead cashier, vice president. All of a sudden, the person who wipes off the counter is an important person, because if they don't do their task right, somebody might get sick. God's pointing you to whatever task he's got for you, and he's equipping you for it. You just have to be willing to do it God's way. And so now we're at verse 11, where Moses should know all of this. Yeah, God, that would make sense. I'm Hebrew. I know my fellow Hebrews are back there in Egypt suffering. That's kind of how I got out here in the desert in the first place. I saw one of them being mistreated, and I tried to do something about it, and it didn't go the way I planned, and I had to run for my life. He knows the people are suffering. He knows God just said, I've heard, and Moses, it's you. I want you to be the one to go and do what I tell you to. And so what does Moses say? But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I? He doesn't want to do it. It seems like a humble question, but it really is pretty darn arrogant when you stop and think about it. Why is he on Mount Sinai in the first place? Because he saw something he didn't understand. What did he see that he didn't understand? A bush that burned but wasn't consumed. Soon as he got up there, he hears the voice of God. And God calls him by name. God doesn't just say, hey, you. God doesn't have senior moments. Actually, it was last Sunday. There's a restaurant nearby here that when church is over with, our family goes to that restaurant because it's literally the only one really on this side of the town. And we had lunch. And as we're getting ready to go, on the way out the door, there's a guy standing at the entrance. And when he sees my husband, he starts talking to him like he's known him. And Mark's talking back. And you know how you can tell from the look on somebody's face that you're talking to somebody and you just don't have the first blessed clue. Mark didn't have the first clue. But they're carrying on this conversation. And when it's, all right, well, see you later. Thanks. Good to see you. That kind of generic response. We get outside the door and I ask him, who is that? Because I don't know who it is, but it may be somebody that my husband knew from when he worked out at the prison. That's my best guess. And Mark goes, I don't have the first idea. God doesn't have senior moments. Moses showed up. God called him by name. The question seems humble. Who am I that I should do this? But it's really, when you think about it, not such a humble question. He doesn't want to do what God wants him to do. It's the wrong question. Who am I? Well, the correct answer, Moses, is in spite of your training in Egypt, in spite of your years as a military commander, in spite of your years as a shepherd in the desert working for your father-in-law, you're nobody when it comes up against Pharaoh. But you're not going in your own power. God just said, I am calling you to go do this. The question's not, who am I? The question is, who is God and how big is God? In fact, Moses is going to ask that question again in just a minute. He asked the question, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And God replies back to him, certainly, I will be with you. Moses, you're not doing this alone. The God who can make a bush catch fire but not burn. The God who can speak as a voice from heaven that you can hear. That God the God who took care of, because remember, he's already identified him. I'm the God of Abraham. I'm the God of Isaac. I'm the God of Jacob. Moses knows these stories. They're in his family tree. These stories have been passed down from generation to generation already. He should know God made a covenant with Abraham and all the great things that God did for Abraham, including things like Abraham, age 100, Sarah, age 90, finally having the child that God promised them. He should know the stories of Isaac and the stories of Jacob and how God had Jacob prosper. And God's now telling Moses, in answer to his objection, who am I that I should do this? Basically, what God's saying is, son, it's not really you. I'm going to do this work. You're my vessel. I'm going to choose you and use you to make this happen. But I, God, will be with you every step of the way. I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you that it is I who sent you when you have brought the people out of Egypt. You shall worship God at this mountain. What mountain? Mount Sinai. Where's Mount Sinai? It's near where Jethro would normally have his sheep pastured. Who's Jethro? Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Midian is what you and I would know as Saudi Arabia. It's not the Sinai Peninsula. It's the Arabian Peninsula. Mount Sinai. Moses was close enough to see this mountain from where he's pasturing his father-in-law's sheep on the west side of the peninsula. Then Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I'll say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Moses just asked God, if I do this, then the people might ask me, who is this God? Moses is assuming that the people don't know that much about God. They should know at least as much as he knows about Abraham, about Isaac, about Jacob. And then he asked him, God, what's your name? Who should I say? God knew Moses by name. Moses is about to know God by name. We're in chapter 3. We had some folks come in. We're in chapter 3, starting in verse 14. God, what shall I say? What's your name? And God tells him, I am who I am. In Hebrew, that would be Yahweh. It gets transliterated into English as Jehovah, the sacred name of God. I am that I am. And he, God, if you've got a Bible that is properly capitalizing references to the deity, right after I am who I am, and he said that he should be capitalized. Some translations, they get a little sloppy about that, but it's a reference to God, so it's capitalized. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial, a name to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, all capital letters, Lord, God's sacred name, I am. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say. They who? Those elders of Israel. They will pay heed to what you say, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go on a, notice this, a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. He's not going to do it willingly. God's going to have to force Pharaoh to let the people go. So I will stretch out my hand. Now notice the my is capitalized. Whose hand is being stretched out? Not Moses's. Moses started out by objecting and saying, who am I? And then he asked, God, what's your name? Who are you? God is letting him know, I am. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. I am the God of the Hebrews. And by extension, Moses, I am your God. And by extension, down through the ages, thanks to Jesus Christ, he is the God of you and me, if we choose to accept his offer of salvation. So I will stretch out my hand. This is God doing the talking in verse 20. And strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I will do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be when you go, you will not go out empty-handed. Moses knows what it's like to go out empty-handed. When he accidentally killed that Egyptian while breaking up the Egyptian from abusing the Hebrew slave, Moses had to flee with the clothes on his back. He knows what it's like to start completely over. Sometimes when bad things happen to people, they get mad at God because they have to start over. And they say, God, why did you let this happen to me? Whether it was they lost everything through a hurricane or through some other kind of natural disaster. God, why did you let this happen to me? God is with us through it all. We don't go through the tragedies of life alone. God is with us. Emmanuel means God with us. You will not go out empty-handed. They're not. When they go out, they're going to take 400 years worth of back wages and spoils out of Egypt with them, and the Egyptians are going to be willing to let them have it all. But every woman shall ask her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and you'll put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians. Then Moses said, because God has answered his question, but Moses has butt-itis. He does not want to do this task, so he comes up with another objection. What if they won't believe me or listen to what I have to say? For they may say the Lord hasn't appeared to you. He's already told them that the elders of Israel, which is interesting by itself, these people are slaves, but yet they still know after 400 years as a slave which family they belong to. They know that they're from the family of Levi in Moses' case, or of Dan, or of Benjamin, or of Judah, or of Reuben, or of any of the other sons. And even within their structure as slaves of Egypt, they have certain people that they are already recognizing as being leaders within our family, the go-to persons, the persons who seem to be wise and have the answers. That's why he's calling them elders already. What if? God's already told them, these people, the elders, are going to believe you. They'll listen to you. But what if they don't? What if they say the Lord has not appeared to you? The Lord said to him, what's that in your hand? And he said, a staff, because as a shepherd, he would need a staff, a shepherd's staff. You've seen it in Christmas plays, if nothing else. It'll have a little hook on the end. Why? Because sometimes the shepherd has to use the hook to reach out and get the sheep by the neck or the goat and guide them in a new direction, because sheep are dumb. They literally will walk off a cliff. And sometimes the shepherd has to do that. In the chaplain corps, this could be a little bit of an America's religious history moment. In the chaplain corps in the Army, which George Washington asked the Continental Army to appoint chaplains a year before we broke away from England, when they were forming the Continental Army. Chaplains used to have an insignia that was a shepherd's crook that identified they're a chaplain. In other words, they're a non-combatant, but they're the spiritual advisors. It wasn't until, regrettably, many, many years later that they started wearing rank. And sometimes, because chaplains are officers and they can be anywhere from a lieutenant up to a general, sometimes they let the rank side of their collar override the pastoral symbol. It used to be just a shepherd's crook because initially we only had Christian chaplains. Then we got some Jewish chaplains, and now we have chaplains from a lot of different faith groups. So a Jewish chaplain will wear a Ten Commandments tablet. A Christian chaplain will wear a cross. A Muslim chaplain will wear the crescent. A Buddhist chaplain wears, is a different kind of symbol, but they have a symbol. Moses here has a shepherd's staff. He uses it to keep the sheep and goats in line. God just said, okay, what's that in your hand? He asked God who God was, what was God's name, after he asked, who am I? That's the wrong order. Always put God first and yourself in a lower position. Moses started off, who am I that I should do this? Well, Moses, it ain't going to be you anyway. It's going to be God working through you. Get your priorities right. It's God first. And God's about to get his attention. What's that in your hand, Moses? It's a staff. He would need that. Then he said, throw it to the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. I laugh when I read that, because at that moment I can relate to Moses. Snake, run! Go the other way. I saw a YouTube video. Somebody posted it on Facebook just the other day. These two grown men are riding on this bicycle, and they turn the corner and they're about to go down this hill, and there's a snake slithering across, and they can't avoid the snake. The snake and the bicycle meet, and the snake gets tangled up in the wheel spoke of the front wheel of this bicycle. The two men on the bike, what are they doing? Their legs are as high up in the air, you would think they were a woman in labor. They're trying. Why? Because the snake's down there, and they don't want to get bit. They hop off the bike, and they run in the other direction. The snake is now tangled up inside the bicycle wheel. Hey, if I'm the guys on the bike, Mr. Slither can have that bicycle. I'll go get me another one. What does it say here in the scripture? That staff. Yes, I have a problem. Out at the chapel, my motto used to be, have props, will travel. It's actually kind of how I wound up being at this church. Had props, was invited to come out here and guest speak, and me and the props came, and here we are 6 years later, and we're still here. Went on a chapel retreat to the Bahamas, a floating 24-hour eat-a-thon and Bible study cruise. And when we landed in the Bahamas for one of our port calls, I saw these very talented artisans. They take these pieces of wood, and they'll make all kinds of shapes for you. And they had made several snake shapes. But the ones that they made that were snakes had like Bahamas or Nassau or something on there. And I told the guy, look, I'll buy one of those, but not if it has the words Bahamas, snake, USA, anything like that on there. I need it as a prop for Bible stories. Well, this guy happened to be a Christian, and he understood instantly what it was I meant. So I had the fascinating opportunity to stand there and watch him take a piece of wood and a machete, and he just hacked away and created this cool prop that we have used out at the chapel. The Dan tribe always got to get it and carry it around. Moses's stick of wood that he's been using to guide the sheep with for a long time. Maybe in his 40 years of being a shepherd, he's had a dozen shepherd staffs. It turns into a snake, and he's just realized, gotten the answer to his question, God, who are you? God's the God who can take a stick of wood and turn it into a living, breathing, slithering, biting serpent. And Moses is a feet don't fail me now type of person at this point. He's on the run. That was the end of verse 3, so Moses fled from it. And we can all picture that, because we can see ourselves hiking up those robes and running for all your... And remember, he's barefoot. He had to take his shoes off when he got on the holy ground. Moses is going the other way. But God said, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grab it by its tail. I confess, If God told me to pick up a snake by the tail, I would have a very difficult time obeying that instruction, because you could grab it by this end, but snakes are very flexible. This end of him can turn. But Moses actually did what God said for him to do there. Moses, stretch out your hand and grab it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand again. Moses, you just got your answer to the first big but. Who am I? Well, Moses, you're not anybody, but God, you're somebody when God's with you, that God's going to gift you for the task. God's going to equip you for the task, and God's going to be with you when you do the task. God, who are you? You're the God who can turn this into a living snake and turn it back into a stick of wood again. When it comes to our day and time, it's one thing to read the stories. When it comes to our day and time and the troubles that we're facing and the uncertainty that we have in our lives, when God calls us to do something, whether it's a church to be on mission to go out and spread the gospel, whether it's an individual to go and witness to a family member, a neighbor, a friend, if God is calling you to go and do something, here's what you need to remember, what you should learn, the lesson of Moses. You're not going alone. God's going with you. God's going to equip you. All you have to do is be obedient to God. God has a task for Moses. Moses just has to be willing to obey. He's going to have some more objections. We're going to look some more at Moses next week for session number 10. But know this, you're going through life this week. You'll have some challenges. Whether they're in your home, they're in your work, your lack of a job, society, some kind of challenge. But if you're a believer, you're on mission for God, and God has some kind of way that he wants you to be his light to a needy world. And if you're not a believer, God wants you to come to salvation, and he will send people in your path to share the word with you. Your task would be to listen to the voice of God and to accept his offer of salvation. That's the first step in your walk of faith. We'll see you next week for session number 10.